Gude. I'm Oma and I would like to show you Continental Knitting, or as I call it, the Oma Way of knitting. Oma is the German word for grandmother, and Gude is the way of saying hi in the region I come from in Germany, which is Frankfurt. I'm sure that the most of you know Frankfurt because there is this big airport. I call it also the Oma Way of knitting because over the years I have tried to simplify the process and try to do a step-by-step instruction on the knitting. For the past 50 years, active knitting and needlework always had been part of my everyday life. I learned knitting in a very young age when I entered the German school system, because at the time it was mandatory. The girls went to needlework, doing embroidery, crocheting, sewing and knitting, while the boys went to the workshop and learned how to hold the hammer, which makes sense. Learning the craft of knitting is a process. It doesn't work that you just pick up needles, yarn, have it seen for maybe 10 minutes and believe you can already knit a Norwegian sweater or all the beautiful stuff which you might have seen on the internet or on magazines. It is a long-term process, like learning the ABC. Learning the ABC doesn't make you a writer, and that's how you have to see it. But most of all, you should take the pressure away. After one session, I can tell you already, you will not be able to knit, but you might have gotten the understanding for it. See it as a piano lesson. Having one lesson doesn't make you Beethoven, and I don't mean the dog. Continental knitting, the Oma Way. Why, you might ask? Because, as I mentioned already, I developed over the 50 years I was knitting simpler technique to show it as well to others, because that always had been my goal, giving an old handiwork and tradition to the generations that come after me so that it will not get lost. The technique of Oma Way of knitting is very well structured, and the technique makes it easier. The stitches are more even. You can relax while doing it, and I will be able to show you how to turn your hands into machines and tools. Prepare yourself with the materials and tools I will use in this video. First of all, I want you to get a pair of knitting needles, aluminum, single pointed, 10 inches long in size 7. You need to get a measuring tape, which will be known to all of you what it is, a pair of scissors, a darning needle, cotton yarn, and I'm using cotton yarn because it doesn't stretch us. So it also, while learning the knitting, will force you to keep the right positions with your hands and with your needles. So there is a kind of force to it which I like very much, because it will always remind you of what I have tried to teach you before. And now comes the best, the chittabun. The best since the invention of fried potatoes, or as the Americans say, the greatest thing since sliced bread, which is a row counter. You can get it in arts and crafts stores as well as in wool shops. It is a little machine which counts the row while pushing the button on top. And I'm going to use the hands free so that I don't need to interrupt while knitting my work, and you just wrap it around your neck, and after each row you have finished, you just push that little white button on the top and you have already the first row. What is knitting? And I would like you to become aware of that handicraft knitting and what actually is happening, why you are doing it, and to understand why do I create a pattern. Knitting is a handicraft that is done with yarn and always 2 needles. Moving the stitches from one needle onto the others in a certain technique creates the row, and after several rows you create the pattern. Following the basics of cast on, of doing the actually knit stitch, and of binding off starts and finishes your work. You are all set up to start. I'm going to show you how to make your first project, which is a washcloth. I always like the idea, even if you are a beginner and during the learning process, to achieve something useful and to see the success. Reward yourself after you finished your washcloth. Go in a nice store, get a face wash and use for the first time your washcloth. If you have reached that point and didn't give up at all, you can be very proud. You might ask yourself how to use the yarn. Some of the people would take the ball of yarn which they bought and would try to go on the inside to find the end of the yarn, pull it out and work with the yarn as they had bought it. But I would recommend that you open up your yarn and you take the outside end and you start to wind up a ball, which is easy to do. You wind the yarn a few times around your hand, take it down, go in the center, fold it in half, and then you go and exchange always from top to butt and to top, and make sure that you wind the yarn away from you, so not towards you, because you will hit yourself and you will be in your own way. So just wind it up from the bottom to the top, and then from left to right, and you continue till you have reached a ball, and you also partially do wind the yarn about a diagonal so that it is equal, and you end up with a ball like this. The reason I'm going to do this is if you take the end out of the center, sometimes there are knots within the yarn inside, and while you worked already on your project, you need to put your work down to unknot what was in the center of the wool. And if you have it rolled, you have first of all the yarn already more loose, which makes it easier to lead the yarn through your hand, and you can be sure that you will have no knot. And now I'm going to show you the first step of knitting, which is the cast on. I'm going to use 2 needles to cast on the stitches, and I explain you why. If you are going to use, those are cast on stitches already on the needle, and as you can see, if you have it on one needle, each of the stitch is very tight and hard to get in with your second working needle. If you use 2 needles, like I did here, in the end, after you have cast on your stitches, you hold one needle on the tip, pull the other needle out, and you can see that the stitches are a lot more loose, and it's easy for you to get with your needle into the stitches, because the first row always is very hard to knit. I'm going to show you now how to hold the yarn. And I would like you to cut a piece of yarn about 40-50 inches, because this is just for practice and this yarn you will not use for knitting. I just want you to understand, and learning how to knit is also about understanding the craft of knitting. You take that short piece of yarn, you open up your hand, you go between the pinky and the ring finger from the inside, wrap the yarn over ring finger, middle finger and index finger, and then you wrap it twice around your index finger. Make sure that you do not have coming from the outside in the inside, because in that case you have the yarn in the middle, where you also have to hold your needle, and the needle will be in the way to let the yarn over your index finger, slide over your index finger. So again, you come from the inside with the short end, actually, hold the long end, which is on the wool, go over ring finger, middle finger, pointing finger, and wrap it around. And I want you now to pull the yarn slowly over your fingers so that you get a feeling of how the yarn has to move. And you can take your time and can exercise this a few times, and it is important to understand how the yarn is running. After you have done this, I'm going to show you how to hold the knitting needle in your left hand. Open your hand. You don't have the yarn. I will show you later then how to combine and coordinate those two moves. You hold the knitting needle on the end, put it onto your hand, and now comes what I call unit 1, which is the ring finger and the pinky, which will hold the needle. And the needle as well will be on the side of your hand so that it is stabilized and cannot move. Then you use unit 2, which I call the thumb and the middle finger, and hold the needle, and those two fingers will control your work. So remember, unit 1, pinky and ring finger will stabilize the needle and hold the needle. Unit 2, middle finger and thumb will control the work, and the index finger is the yarn finger, the third unit, which controls the yarn and the tension of the yarn. Now you can go to your ball of wool. You leave about 40 inches, which is called the short tail. You can also use 50 inches because you would like to have rather more of the yarn on the short tail end and have enough to make your stitches, than having it too short and then you are missing still 3, 4 or 5 stitches and you need to start all over again because the short tail was too short. You rather cut it then in the end. You go with the yarn on the inside, and this is already step 2, the cast on. You go with the long end, the working end, between ring finger and pinky. Wrap the yarn twice around your index finger. Go on the inside around your thumb, wrap it around. Go back with that long end to your pinky and you close your hands. And this is the way to cast on the stitches. Again, You come with the long end, which is connected, the working end, to your ball. You go between pinky ring finger, wrap it outside around your index finger. Go with the long end from the inside around your thumb. Cross the yarn, go back with the working end to your pinky and close the hand which holds the yarn and prepares to cast on. The next step is actually to cast on the stitches. You take both of your knitting needles, have them next to each other. You go underneath into the loop of the thumb, pick up the yarn from the index finger, pull it through the loop of the thumb. You drop the loop, go underneath the loop to the working yarn, stretch it, and you have your first stitch. Again, if you might lose one of the yarns, so what you need to look out for is the short end always between the pinky and the long end goes always around the thumb. And when you pull the needles down, you have a V. And if you have this position, it means you have the right position to continue casting on. So again, you go underneath in the loop of your thumb, you take the yarn from your index finger, pull it through the loop. You drop the loop from the thumb, you go underneath the dropped loop and stretch the working yarn till you reach the needles with the stitch. Again, the V underneath the thumb into the loop. Pick up the yarn from your index finger, pull it through the loop of the thumb, go underneath the dropped loop, stretch the yarn, and you have the next stitch. You have now cast on 40 stitches. That's what you need to make your washcloth. Your cast on stitches might be all turned around and not lined up as you expected them to do. It doesn't matter, it's not a problem at all, so don't worry about it. What you do is you start on the tip with your stitches. You can see here is the actually stitch line, and you just turn the yarn in the direction till you have all stitches lined up, straight and lined up, so that the cast on stitches are all on the bottom of the knitting needle. And you should do it as long as you have both needles. It makes it easier to do. And then you have them all lined up. You hold now one needle on the tip and pull the other one out. The short end, if it is too long, you just cut it till you have about 8 inches left. Mine is almost 8 inches, but I demonstrate it anyway so that you would remember. Now you put your work down because I need to explain you how to use the needle in the right hand. It's exactly the same way as you use it in your left hand. But the right hand has, of course, different work to do. You take the needle again on the end, have it over your right hand on the side of the right hand, and unit 1 holds the needle again. You come with unit 2, which is thumb and the middle finger, and the third unit, the index finger has for the right needle the job to do the actually work and knitting, whereas the left index finger is holding the yarn and is responsible for the tension. The right index finger is responsible actually for the knit stitches and the work you are planning to do. You have now your one needle in the right hand, and you leave between the working unit, the middle finger and thumb, about 1 inch to the tip, so that you work always only with the two tips of the knitting needles having a distance from 1 inch. You start now with your left needle. Have the working yarn, you better start with the left needle. I made it wrong now. You use first your working needle with the working yarn on it. Hold the needle with the stitches. Go between, with the needle, between your ring finger and pinky. Pull the yarn over your index finger with the work on the needle, wrap it around, and then you bring your working needle in position, which means ring finger and pinky hold the needle. You have here you have stability through the side of your hand. The middle finger and thumb hold the stitches, and you should hold about behind the first 3 or 4 stitches. The index finger is always stretched, and if you keep the index finger stretched, nothing will happen, just ignore him. And you push now the stitches all the way up to front till you have only 1 inch left. The yarn is behind the needle, which means you turn the stitches around so that they are in the inside between the two hands. And you wrap the yarn, the working yarn, around so that the working yarn is in the back of the needle. You go in position. You use then the right needle and have it the same way in position. Wrap around ring finger and pinky. Control the work with your middle finger and thumb and go all the way down to the tip that you have about 1 inch left. Now the first stitch. You go from underneath of the stitch, wrap around the yarn from your index finger and pull it through the stitch on the needle. You use your right index finger, push again the left needle and drop the stitch, and this is your first knitting stitch. Make sure that the distance between the left index finger and the right needle is not more than 2 inches. If you have a too much distance, it happens that the yarn, you cannot even grab the yarn, so it's too wide. If you are too close and have not enough yarn in between, you will also not be able to pick up the stitch. So the ideal is that you have between the right needle and the left index finger about 2 inches. Make sure that your right thumb, the left middle finger, is holding the needle with the work on from the back and stabilizes, and the thumb is underneath the third stitch on the left needle, and that is your working room. It's 1 inch on both needles to the tip and behind 3 stitches on the needle with the work on. You go again into the needle, pick up the yarn from the left index finger, pull it through, push it all up to the front to the tip, and drop it. Again, go in from underneath, pick up the yarn of the left index finger and take it down. You will realize that the more stitches you work down, the distance on your left needle becomes, of course, wider. What you do there is you just hold both of the needles and push with your middle finger and thumb all the stitches up to the front. And then again, go underneath, pick up the yarn on the index finger and pull it down. After a while, you don't even need to use your index finger to push it anymore. You just take the stitch down and drop it. Go underneath, wrap around the yarn from your index finger, pull it through and take it down. Now comes middle finger because you need a few more stitches on top of the needle. Hold it again. Go underneath, pick up the yarn, take the stitch down. After having learned how to do the knit stitch on the needle, I need to explain to you that the last and the first stitch of the needles are treated differently. They are called the edge stitches. So you continue knitting your 40 stitches till the end of the row. You do the last stitch and you will see that your work is all on the left side of the needle. First of all, after having done the last stitch, what you do is the click with your row counter. Because if you would use the washcloth instead of a washcloth, using it as a pot holder, you want to make sure that the second pot holder is done in exactly the same measurements. What you have to do now is you turn around, you leave the yarn where it is and you turn around the needle, make a half round, and as you see, the yarn is still in the back, and that's where it needs to be. You go again then, hold the work with your left middle finger and thumb, pull down the empty needle and take it into your right hand the way as described, and then you can start again. But instead of knitting the first stitch, you go into the first stitch and just take it down. And then you continue knitting your row. And I will show it to you again. Go underneath, knit, go underneath, knit. I don't have 40 stitches here on that needle to just finish it faster, that I can show you how to treat the edge stitches. So you make your last stitch. Now comes the click. You turn the needle with the work a half turn, pull down with the right hand the empty needle, and you can start all over again. Take the first one down, continue knitting till the end, make your click, make a half round with the work, with the needle and the work on the needle, and exchange the needles. And I'm going to show you now why it is called edge stitch. The edge stitch, this is the side of the work, and as you can see, the edge stitch stabilizes the work so that it doesn't stretch in all directions. And if you, maybe so you can see it better, and if you are planning on stitching two pieces together It also helps you while showing you the stitches to line them up and easily sew them together. That's why it's called edge stitch. There's different edge stitches, but this is the most used, I would say. After you have finished your 70 rows in 40 stitches, you are going to bind off your work. You have the needles again in position as explained. You take the first stitch down. You knit the second stitch. You go with the needle in the left hand over the second stitch on the right needle and pull the stitch over it and drop it. Again, you stitch the second stitch onto the right needle. You go with the left needle into the first stitch on the right needle. You pull the second stitch through and drop it. Again, knitting, take it down. Go with the left needle into the first, pull it over the second, and hold the second stitch with the left needle, pull it through and drop it. Again, go in, knit, take it over, go in, pull it over, take it down. Knit, go in the first stitch with the left needle, pull with the right needle the stitch down and drop it. Once you are going to reach the last stitch, you do it exactly the same way. And then again, you cut the yarn about 8 inches and you just pull the yarn through and your work is finished. I completely forgot to tell you how to finish up your work, which means sewing the beginning yarn and the end yarn into the washcloth. What you have to do is take your darning needle, put the yarn in, and you go into, you hold with the left hand your work, and you go into the stitches diagonal, because that will hide the last yarn the best. And I will show you once I have the needle through. You always go so that the needle is in diagonal underneath the stitches. Make sure you don't go all the way through the other side. You will not see the yarn on the other side or the needle. You go on one side diagonal into the stitches, pick them up, and then you pull the yarn through. Make sure you don't pull too tight, because then you pull your work together. But if that happens, not a problem either. You just stretch it again, and then you come from the top again, pick up the stitches in diagonal. You have the stitches diagonal again. The best is you hold then with your thumb the yarn on the end so that you will not pull it too tight. Get the needle through very loose, hold it, take the needle out, and then you cut the end. You should not work with knots, because by washing your washcloths, a knot could open, which means then also that your whole work could open again and would very much upset you, I guess. So never a knot in the end, just do it a wig as I have shown you in the diagonal sewing the yarn. I hope this video was helpful for you, and I always would like to have a feedback which you can put either on the YouTube page or on my web page, the Oma Way, where you also can find a collection of tips about homemaking, needlework, family life, and of course how to organize and structure your life with children to make it easier and much more fun. I wish you success in your very first project of knitting. Tschüss und mach's gut.